The complete story of Bus 375, Beijing's most haunting urban legend. There are places in this world where the veil between our reality and something else grows thin. Crossroads, where the living and the dead might pass each other in the dark. And sometimes those places aren't ancient, burial grounds or forgotten temples. Sometimes they're as mundane as a city bus making its final run of the night. This is the story of Bus 375, a tale that has haunted the streets of Beijing for decades, a legend that refuses to die, no matter how many times it's been debunked, dismissed, or explained away. It's a story that continues to make passengers think twice before boarding the last bus home, a story that has become woven into the fabric of modern Chinese folklore. But to understand this legend, to truly comprehend why it has such a grip on the collective imagination, we must journey back to a cold November night in 1995, to a city caught between tradition and modernity, between the old ways and the new world. We must walk the streets of Beijing as darkness falls, and board a bus that may have carried more than just the living. Part 1. The Night. Everything changed. November 14th, 1995. The date is seared into the minds of those who know this story. It was a Tuesday, though the day of the week seems almost irrelevant in the face of what allegedly transpired. What matters is that it was late autumn in Beijing, a time when the city begins its slow descent into winters. Grasp. 1995. Beijing was a city in transition. The economic reforms that had begun in the late 70s were now in full swing, transforming the ancient capital into a modern metropolis. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the construction cranes and the new buildings rising toward the sky, the old Beijing remained. The hutongs, those narrow alleyways that had seen centuries of Chinese history, still snaked through the city. The ancient temples still stood, their incense thick in the air, and the beliefs, the superstitions, the stories passed down through generations, they too remained, particularly among the older residents who remembered a different China. The public transportation system in Beijing was, and remains, the lifeblood of the city. Millions of people depend on the buses and subways to navigate the vast urban sprawl. In 1995, before the subway system had expanded to its current impressive network, buses were even more crucial. They ran from early morning until late at night, connecting every corner of the city, carrying workers, students, families, and anyone else who needed to cross Beijing's enormous distances. But there's something different about the last bus of the night. There's a peculiar atmosphere that descends when you're one of the final passengers, traveling through streets that have grown quiet, past buildings that have gone dark. The cheerful chatter of daytime travel gives way to silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional squeak of brakes. Fellow passengers become shadows, strangers whose faces you can barely. The Yuanmingyuan terminus, known in English as the Old Summer Palace, and terminated at Xiangshan, or Fragrant Hills, a beautiful parkland area in Beijing's western hills. The journey would have covered a substantial distance through the northwestern section of the city. The route itself passed through areas that carried tremendous weight in Chinese history. Yuanmingyuan, the Old Summer Palace, had once been the crown jewel of Chinese imperial architecture, a vast complex of gardens, palaces, and treasures that rivaled anything in the world. But in 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French forces had looted and burned it to the ground, leaving only ruins as a reminder of both past glory and national humiliation. By 1995, it had been transformed into a public park, but the ghosts of history still seemed to linger among the broken columns and charred stones. The route also passed near prestigious Peking University and Tsinghua University, institutions that had educated generations of China's brightest minds. Further along, it traveled through areas that had once been rural villages, but were now being absorbed into Beijing's relentless urban expansion. And finally, it reached Fragrant Hills, a place of natural beauty that had served as an imperial retreat for centuries, where emperors had gone to escape the summer heat and contemplate the changing seasons. In 1995, this northwestern section of Beijing was still somewhat removed from the bustling city center. After 8 o'clock in the evening, the streets would grow quiet. The students would be back in their dormitories. The workers would be home with their families, and the shops would have closed their doors. By the time the last bus made its final run, often around midnight, the area would be nearly deserted. Based on what we know about Beijing buses of that era, the vehicle would likely have been typical of the time. Public buses in 1995 China generally had a driver's compartment in front and a conductor stationed near the middle doors to check tickets and help passengers board. The interior would typically feature rows of hard plastic seats, overhead handrails for standing passengers, and windows that often didn't seal properly, letting in the cold night air. The lighting would have been harsh fluorescent tubes, creating pools of yellow light, interspersed with shadows. On this particular November night, the temperature had dropped significantly. Beijing's autumn is brief, but beautiful, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures. But by mid-November, winter begins to assert itself. The wind picks up, carrying dust from the Gobi Desert. The bare branches of trees rattle against each other. People bundle up in thick coats and scarves, hurrying from warmth to warmth, reluctant to linger in the cold. According to the legend, Bus 375 departed from the Yuanmingyuan terminus on its final run of the night. The exact time varies in different versions of the story. Some say it left at 10 o'clock in the evening. Others insist it was the true midnight bus, departing at 12. The discrepancy doesn't particularly matter to the core of the legend, but it speaks to how stories evolve as they're retold, how details shift and change with each telling. What matters is that it was late, it was dark, and it was cold. The kind of night when sensible people are already home, warm in their beds, or gathered around their television sets. The kind of night when the streets belong to. Part 2. The Weight of History. To truly understand why this particular bus route became the center of such a powerful legend, we must delve deeper into the places it connected and the history that soaked the very ground it traveled over. The Yuanmingyuan, the old summer palace, was not simply a royal residence. It was a statement, a manifestation of imperial power and cultural achievement rendered in stone, wood, water, and living plants. Construction began in 1709 under Emperor Kangxi, but it was Emperor Qianlong who truly transformed it into something extraordinary. By the mid-18th century, the complex covered over 350 hectares, encompassing hundreds of buildings, pavilions, temples, and galleries arranged around an intricate network of lakes, streams, and islands. The gardens were famous throughout the world. Jesuit missionaries who visited the complex sent back breathless descriptions of its wonders. The 40 Scenes of Yuanmingyuan, a series of paintings commissioned by Emperor Qianlong, captured only a fraction of its magnificence. There were reproductions of famous landscapes from across China, buildings in both Chinese and European architectural styles, and countless treasures looted from across the empire and beyond. But all of that ended in October 1860. As the Second Opium War drew to a close, a combined British and French expeditionary force marched on Beijing. When they reached the old summer palace, they found it, defended only by a handful of eunuchs. What followed was one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in history. For 3 days, soldiers looted everything they could carry: priceless porcelain, jade carvings, silk, paintings, gold and silver objects. All were loaded onto carts and wagons. Then, on October 18th, the British High Commissioner to China, Lord Elgin, ordered the palace burned. His justification was that it would punish the Qing court for the torture and death of British envoys. But the real message was clear. Britain had the power to destroy the very symbol of Chinese imperial glory, and there was nothing the Qing Dynasty could do to stop it. The fire burned for 3 days and nights. Witnesses reported that the smoke could be seen for miles, a dark column rising into the autumn sky. When it finally died down, only ruins remained. A few buildings survived, particularly in the outlying gardens, but the heart of the complex was gone. The 12 bronze animal heads that had adorned the great fountain were looted, and several remain in foreign museums to this day, a continuing source of resentment. For the Chinese people, the destruction of Yuanmingyuan became a symbol of national humiliation, a reminder of the century of defeats and foreign domination that followed. The ruins were left largely untouched for over a century, a deliberate memorial to that trauma. It wasn't until the 1980s that the government finally moved to turn the area into a public park, but even then, many ruins were left standing, preserved as a reminder. So when Bus 375 departed from the Yuanmingyuan terminus in 1995, it was leaving from ground soaked in. The route then traveled westward, passing through what had been, until recently, the countryside on Beijing's outskirts. In 1995, this area was in the midst of transformation. Traditional courtyard homes were being demolished to make way for apartment blocks. Old villages were being absorbed into the expanding city. The road itself was often poorly lit, passing through stretches where darkness pressed in from both sides. Fragrant Hills, the destination, had its own supernatural reputation. The area had been an imperial retreat since the Qing Dynasty in the 12th century. Emperors had built palaces and temples among the wooded hills, seeking respite from the summer heat of Beijing. The Qing emperors, the same dynasty that built Yuanmingyuan, had also favored the area. The fragrant hills had witnessed centuries of imperial intrigue, religious devotion, and natural beauty. But Fragrant Hills was also remote. In 1995, it was still very much on the edge of the city. After dark, the area would be nearly deserted. The road leading to it cut through areas where old burial grounds lay hidden just off the pavement, where the trees grew thick, where civilization's lights didn't reach. It was the kind of place where, if something happened, you could cry for help and no one would hear you. This was the route Bus 375 traveled, a route connecting places heavy with history, running through darkness, serving those who had no other choice but to brave the night. Is it any wonder that such a route would become the setting for a ghost story? Part 3. The Passengers of the Night. The bus that left Yuanmingyuan that November night carried, according to most versions of the legend, a small number of passengers. The exact composition varies depending on who's telling the story, but certain figures appear consistently enough that they've become canonical to the tale. There was the driver, naturally. In Chinese urban transit culture of that era, Bus drivers were working class, heroes of a sort, people who kept the city moving through long shifts and difficult conditions. They knew their routes intimately, could navigate through terrible traffic, and dealt with passengers of all kinds from the grateful to the irate. A driver working the last shift would have been someone used to the solitude of late-night runs, accustomed to the strange atmosphere that descends when most of the city sleeps. Alongside the driver was the conductor. This was a position that has largely disappeared from modern Chinese buses, but in 1995 it was still common. The conductor's job was to check tickets, help passengers board safely, announce stops, and generally keep order on the bus. They would often stand near the middle doors, calling out the next destination, making sure everyone paid their fare. The conductor was often a woman, and this detail appears in many versions of the Bus 375 legend. Among the passengers, two figures stand out as central to every version of the story. First, there was an older passenger, described sometimes as an old woman, sometimes as an old man. This person had the wisdom of years, the sharp eyes that had seen much, and most importantly, the knowledge of old beliefs and old ways. In experience, they might have been returning from visiting family, or perhaps from working a late shift, because in China, retirement is often more a concept than a reality for those without substantial means. The other crucial figure was a young man, often described as a student or young worker. He would have been in his 20s, perhaps wearing a jacket and jeans, carrying a bag with books or work materials. Young, full of modern education and rational thinking, the kind of person who would have rolled their eyes at talk of ghosts and superstitions. In the China of 1995, this was a common generational divide. The older generation, maintaining traditional beliefs, while the younger generation embraced modernity and science. Some versions of the story include additional passengers, a young couple, seated at the front of the bus, perhaps, returning from a date, absorbed in each other and paying little attention to their surroundings. These figures appear in some tellings but are absent from others, and their role in the story is minimal. They serve mainly to establish that the bus wasn't quite empty, that there were witnesses, however peripheral, to the events that would unfold. What's important is the dynamic between the elderly passenger and the young man. They would have been seated in different areas of the bus at first, strangers to each other, each lost in their own thoughts. The young man might have been drowsy, fighting sleep after a long day, looking forward to getting home to his bed. The elderly passenger would have been more alert, eyes moving constantly, taking in everything around them, as elders often do. The atmosphere on the bus would have been quiet, almost oppressive. The rumble of the engine, the squeak of the suspension over rough roads, the whistle of cold wind through imperfect window seals, perhaps a flicker of fluorescent lights overhead, the darkness outside pressing against the windows, broken only occasionally by a streetlight or the lit window of a building. The bus would have made several stops along the route, its brakes hissing as it slowed, doors folding open too. The cold night air. Perhaps no one got on at those stops. Perhaps people got off, workers reaching there. Destinations, students arriving at their residential halls, until the bus grew even emptier. Each departure of a passenger would have made the bus feel larger, more cavernous, the shadows in the back growing deeper. By the time the bus reached the stop where the story truly begins, there would have been only a handful of people left aboard. The driver and conductor in their positions, the elderly passenger and young man seated. Separately, perhaps the young couple if they appear in the version being told. the bus would have felt nearly abandoned, a metal shell moving through darkness, carrying its small cargo of human souls toward the edge of the city. This was the situation when the bus approached a stop, or perhaps merely slowed for figures waving from the roadside. The moment when everything changed. The moment when the ordinary became extraordinary. When a routine bus ride transformed into something that would become legend. Say it was the stop near the south gate of the Summer Palace, just past Yuanmingyuan. Others are less specific, placing it somewhere along the darkened route between the palace ruins and fragrant hills. What matters is that the bus slowed, either because it was scheduled to stop or because the driver saw figures in the road ahead, waving frantically. The driver would have seen them first, of course, illuminated in the headlights. Even from a distance there, would have been something unusual about them. Two men supporting a third between them, the middle figure, appearing to be unable to stand on his own. In the harsh glare of the headlights, details would have been stark and strange. The driver hesitated. This wasn't a proper bus stop, or if it was, these people weren't standing in the designated waiting area. Something about the scene troubled him. Perhaps it was professional caution, perhaps some instinct warning him that something wasn't right. He let his foot hover over the brake, not quite committed to stopping. According to the legend, the conductor intervened. In the story, as it's commonly told, she said something to the effect of it being the last bus, that if they didn't stop, these people would have no way to get where they were going. It was an argument that carried weight. The last bus of the night held a special responsibility in Chinese culture. To leave someone stranded in the dark and cold, miles from home, was seen as cruel. There were no taxis readily available in this part of Beijing in 1995, no ride-sharing apps, no easy alternatives. Miss the last bus, and you faced a long, cold walk or a night spent huddled somewhere waiting for dawn. So the driver stopped. The doors hissed open, letting in a blast of frigid air, and the three figures climbed aboard. This is where the story becomes truly strange. As the three men entered the light of the bus's interior, every passenger who looked up saw something that made their breath catch. The two men supporting the third were wearing long robes, the kind of formal garments that hadn't been common daily wear for nearly a century. Qing Dynasty robes, specifically, the distinctive style that marked the last imperial dynasty of China. The robes were dark, perhaps black or deep blue, made of thick cloth that hung in heavy folds. The men's hair was styled in traditional Manchu fashion, with the front of the head shaved and the back hair grown long and braided into a queue. This hairstyle had been enforced during the Qing Dynasty as a symbol of submission to Manchu rule, and abandoning it had been one of the first acts of the Republican Revolution in 1911. To see men wearing these robes and hairstyles in 1995 was utterly anachronistic. But it was more than just the clothing that disturbed the passengers. The men's faces were unnaturally pale, covered in what looked like thick white powder. Their expressions were blank, emotionless, their eyes staring straight ahead without seeming to see anything. They moved stiffly, mechanically, as they helped the middle, appeared unconscious, or at least unable to support his own weight. His feet dragged slightly as his companions pulled him up the steps and onto the bus. The passengers who were watching, and surely they all were by now, felt a cold dread settling over them. The young couple sitting near the front exchanged glances, their romantic evening forgotten. The young man felt his heart begin to race, though he couldn't have said exactly why. The elderly passenger stared intently at the newcomers, eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight together. The two men supporting the third moved toward the back of the bus, their movements oddly synchronized. They didn't acknowledge the other passengers. They didn't speak to the conductor or show any tickets. They simply moved to a seat in the rear of the bus, deposited their companion between them, and sat down, staring straight ahead. In the legend, the conductor attempted to normalize the situation. According to the story, she offered what seemed like a reasonable explanation, suggesting they might be actors from a period drama being filmed in the area, people who had just finished their shift and forgotten to change out of their costumes. It was a reasonable explanation. Beijing in the 1990s was experiencing a boom in television and film production, with historical dramas being particularly popular. It wasn't entirely implausible that actors in period costume might board a bus late at night, tired after a long day of shooting. The explanation was meant to ease fears, to provide a rational answer to an unsettling situation. But nobody seemed reassured. The explanation didn't quite fit. What production would be filming this late at night? Why would actors in full costume and makeup board a public bus rather than being transported by the production company? And there was something about the three men that went beyond mere costume, something that stirred deep, instinctive unease. The young couple, apparently deciding they didn't want to be on this bus anymore, signaled for the next stop. They left quickly, stepping out into the cold night without looking back. Now there were even fewer passengers, just the driver, the conductor, the elderly passenger, the young man, and the three strange figures in the back. The bus continued on its route. The rumble of the engine seemed louder in the near-empty space. The darkness outside pressed against the windows. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally. And in the back of the bus, the three men in Qing Dynasty robes sat motionless, the middle one's head still hanging forward, his face still, hidden by his tangled hair. The elderly passenger couldn't stop looking back at them. Something about the three men bothered them deeply, tugging at memories and old stories, old warnings. The young man tried to ignore them, telling himself the conductor's explanation made sense, that there was nothing to worry about. But every so often, he found his gaze drawn to the back of the bus, to those strange, still figures. The bus rattled on through the night, carrying its unusual passengers toward fragrant hills. The distance. To understand what the elderly passenger was beginning to suspect, what ancient warnings were stirring in their mind, we must turn to the rich and sometimes terrifying landscape of Chinese supernatural belief. Because what was happening on bus 375 that night, if we accept the legend as told, was tapping into fears that run deep in Chinese culture, fears that have been passed down through countless generations. Chinese supernatural belief is complex and multi-layered, drawing from Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and folk religion that predates them all. Unlike in some Western traditions, where the supernatural is clearly divided between good and evil, angels and demons, Chinese belief acknowledges a wide spectrum of spiritual entities, each with their own nature and rules. Among the most feared of these entities are the jiangshi, often translated as hopping vampire or hopping zombie, though neither term fully captures what they are. The character for jiangshi literally means stiff, corpse, and this stiffness is central to what they are and how they behave. The jiangshi is fundamentally different from the vampires of Western folklore. They don't seduce victims with supernatural charm. They don't transform into bats or mist. They can't pass themselves off as human. a jiangshi, is unmistakably dead, a corpse that has been reanimated through dark magic, spiritual possession, or improper. Burial rites. They move by hopping because rigor mortis has stiffened their joints, forcing them to move with their arms outstretched for balance. It's this hopping movement that gives them their English name, and it's as unsettling as it sounds. The appearance of a jiangshi is the stuff of nightmares. They typically have greenish-white skin, the color of a corpse in advanced decay. Their fingernails have grown long and black, sharp as claws. Their hair is long and unkempt, often white or wild. They're usually depicted wearing the clothes they were buried in, which, during the Qing Dynasty, meant the formal robes and official garments of that era. This detail is crucial to our story. The origins of the jiangshi legend are fascinating, rooted in a real practice that existed during the Qing Dynasty and earlier. When people died far from their ancestral homes, it was considered crucial that their bodies be returned for proper burial in the family plot. This belief stemmed from the importance of ancestor worship in Chinese culture. Being buried properly among one's ancestors was essential for the soul to find peace and for the family's luck to continue. But transporting a corpse across great distances in an era before modern refrigeration or motorized vehicles presented obvious problems. This gave rise to a specialized profession, the corpse driver. These individuals, often Taoist priests or those with knowledge of dark arts, would take responsibility for transporting bodies back to their home villages. The method they employed was both practical and deeply disturbing. The corpse driver would take multiple bodies, stand them upright, and attach them to bamboo poles. Through methods that remain somewhat obscure, possibly involving talismans, charms, and Taoist rituals, they would then march through the night, the bamboo poles carried on their shoulders, the bodies hopping along behind them, traveling only at night to avoid. One can only imagine how terrifying it must have been to hear that bell in the darkness, knowing what was passing by outside. The sight of corpses hopping down a darkened road, moved by unseen forces, would have been horrifying even to those who expected it. And from this real practice, the legend of the jiangshi grew and evolved. Over time, the jiangshi of folklore became more than just transported corpses. They became creatures with their own malevolent will. They were said to drain the life force, or qi, from living beings, particularly by absorbing their breath. Some later versions, influenced by Western vampire stories, added blood-sucking to their repertoire. They could sense the living by detecting their breath and were said to be particularly attracted to people who stayed out after dark or who traveled alone. The jiangshi had weaknesses and could be combated in specific ways. Taoist priests could immobilize them by placing a yellow paper talisman on their foreheads, inscribed with spells and sacred symbols. They could be repelled by mirrors, which would reflect their own horrifying appearance back at them. Sticky rice, glutinous rice, and the sound of a rooster crowing were all traditional deterrents. The hooves of a black donkey were particularly powerful against them, and of course, proper burial rites could lay them to rest permanently. But on a dark bus in the middle of the night, with no Taoist priest at hand, with no yellow paper talismans or jars of sticky rice, what defense did ordinary passengers have if they found themselves in the presence of such creatures? The Qing Dynasty connection is particularly significant to the Bus 375 legend. The Qing Dynasty, which ruled China from 1644 to 1911, was the last imperial dynasty. It was established by the Manchus, a northeastern. People who conquered the Ming Dynasty and imposed their rule over China. The Manchus required Chinese men to adopt the Manchu hairstyle, the queue, as a sign of submission. They also wore distinctive clothing with long robes and formal garments that differed from Ming Dynasty styles. When the Qing Dynasty fell in 1911, there was a rush to abandon these symbols of Manchu rule. Men cut off their queues in symbolic acts of liberation. The old styles of clothing gradually disappeared in favor of more modern or Western-influenced fashion. By 1995, Qing Dynasty clothing and hairstyles existed only in museums, in historical dramas, and in the coffins of the long dead. So, when passengers on bus 375 saw men dressed in perfect Qing Dynasty formal robes with their hair styled in traditional queues, with faces unnaturally pale, which some interpretations of the legend suggest resembled the white powder that corpses were painted with in traditional Chinese funerals, with stiff movements and blank expressions, what were they seeing? Were they seeing actors, as the conductor suggested, or were they seeing something far more sinister? The elderly passenger on the bus would have known all of this. They would have grown up hearing stories of jiangshi from their grandparents, tales told on dark nights to scare children into good behavior. They might even have heard stories from their own childhood about seeing corpse drivers passing through their village. That eerie. Part 6. The Old Woman's Realization. The bus continued through the darkness, and the elderly passenger's unease grew with each passing moment. While the young man tried to convince himself that everything was normal, that the conductor's explanation made sense, the elder couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They kept glancing back at the three figures in Qing Dynasty robes. The way they sat so still, unnaturally still. The way the middle figure's head continued to hang forward, his face still hidden by his wild hair. The way the other two stared straight ahead with blank, emotionless expressions. There was something fundamentally wrong about them, something that went beyond costume and makeup. And then, perhaps, a window in the back of the bus wasn't quite sealed properly, a common problem with buses of that era. A gust of wind came through, cold November air rushing into the bus's interior. It stirred papers on the floor. It made the passengers pull their coats tighter, and it lifted the hems of the long robes worn by the three figures in the back. The elderly passenger, still watching them, saw something that made their blood run cold. As the wind raised the bottom of those dark robes, they saw, or more accurately, they didn't see what should have been there. The robes lifted, but beneath them there were no legs, no feet, just empty cloth billowing in the wind, with nothing beneath it. In Chinese supernatural belief, this is one of the defining characteristics of certain types of ghosts and spirits. They have no feet, no legs, because they're not truly walking on the ground. They float, they glide, they hover. Spirits don't need feet because they don't follow the same physical laws as the living. The absence of feet isn't just strange, it's confirmation. Absolute, terrifying confirmation of supernatural nature. The elderly passenger's mind would have raced. They were on a bus with three jiangshi, or, at the very least, three spirits of the dead. The two supporting figures were likely long-dead corpses animated by dark magic or malevolent will. And the middle figure, with his hanging head and hidden face, might be a fresh victim, someone these creatures had already killed, whose life force they had already drained. But the young man sitting elsewhere on the bus didn't know this. He didn't understand the danger. If the elderly passenger did nothing, when the bus reached its final destination, the driver, the conductor, the young man, and perhaps the elder themselves would all fall victim to these creatures. Empty buses found abandoned, passengers mysteriously disappeared. These were elements of many ghost stories. This bus could become another such tale. Based on the way the legend unfolds, the elderly passenger would have faced a difficult choice. They couldn't simply announce that the three men in the back were ghosts or jiangshi, or so the story suggests. The young man likely wouldn't have believed such a claim. He might have thought the elder was senile, confused. The conductor would probably have tried to calm everyone down, insisting everything was fine. And one could imagine that the creatures themselves, if they were indeed supernatural, might have reacted dangerously too. Interpretation of events paints the elder as both clever and brave, willing to risk appearing foolish or hostile in order to save a stranger's life. In the legend, the bus had stopped or was slowing for a stop. The elderly passenger rose from their seat and moved toward where the young man sat. And then, as the story is told, in a voice loud enough to be heard. Throughout the bus, they began to create a scene. The accusation, as recounted in the legend, was of theft. The elderly passenger accused the young man of stealing their wallet, shouting loudly enough to disturb everyone on the bus. The young man, in the story, responded with genuine confusion and shock, protesting that he hadn't stolen anything, that he'd barely moved from his seat. But the elderly passenger, according to how the tale unfolds, wouldn't be calmed or reasoned with. They insisted that they needed to get off the bus immediately and go to the nearest police station. They wouldn't sit down, wouldn't be quiet, wouldn't let the matter drop. Finally, perhaps more to end the disturbance than anything else, the driver stopped the bus. The doors hissed open. The elderly passenger grabbed the young man's arm and pulled him toward the exit. The young man, protesting his innocence, but also confused and a bit frightened by the situation, allowed himself to be pulled along. As the legend tells it, they stepped off the bus onto the dark street. The doors closed behind them. The bus pulled away, its taillights receding into the darkness, leaving them alone on the empty road. In the story, the young man turned to the elderly passenger, understandably angry. How were they supposed to get home now? Why had the elder made such a scene? The elderly passenger's demeanor changed according to the tale. No longer angry or accusing, their voice became quiet, serious, frightened. They revealed what they had seen, why they had created the disturbance. In the legend's most dramatic moment, the elderly passenger explained that those weren't actors at all. When the wind had come through the window and lifted their robes, the elder had seen underneath. There were no feet, no legs, just empty cloth. Spirits don't have feet because they don't walk on the ground like the living do. The story suggests the young man wanted to dismiss this as nonsense, the paranoid delusions of an old person, steeped in superstition. But something gave him pause. The absolute stillness of those figures, their blank faces, the way they had moved. Something had been fundamentally wrong. But the driver and conductor are still on that bus. And whoever those men are, I know, the elderly passenger said quietly, and there's nothing we can do for them now. But at least you're safe. At least I saved one life tonight. They stood together on the dark street, cold wind cutting through their clothes, the darkness pressing in around. Anger and confusion had faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The young man wanted to believe the elder was wrong, that there was a rational explanation for everything, but the certainty in their voice, the fear in their eyes, and his own memory of those strange, still figures made doubt creep in. Eventually, they had to make a decision. They couldn't stand there all night in the cold. The elderly passenger suggested they try to find their way to the nearest police station to report what they had seen. The young man agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure what they would report, that they'd abandoned a bus because of three
men in old costumes.
According to the legend, they walked through the dark streets of Beijing's western outskirts, two lonely figures, in a vast, sleeping city. Eventually, in the story as told, they found a police station, a small local office with its lights still on. The tale they told must have seemed bizarre to any officers on duty if this encounter happened as described. Claims of ghosts or jiangshi on a city bus, of fleeing for their lives, of remaining passengers in danger. In most versions of the legend, the police response is depicted as one of skepticism verging on dismissal. Based on how the story unfolds, one might imagine the officers thought the elderly passenger was suffering from confusion or dementia, and that the young man was either humoring them or participating in some kind of prank. The legend suggests that the police either took a report but made no real effort to investigate or flatly dismissed the pair and told them to go home. This depiction fits with the story's context. 1995 in Communist China, a society officially dedicated to scientific materialism. The legend implies that police weren't about to launch a search based on supernatural claims, regardless of how earnest the witnesses seemed. The elderly passenger and young man eventually made their way home, probably by walking until they could find other transportation. They would have been exhausted, cold, frightened, and frustrated by the police's refusal to take them seriously. But at least they were alive. At least they were safe. And then came the next morning. Bus 375 failed to report to the station. This wasn't entirely unusual. Buses sometimes broke down or encountered problems. But when the dispatcher tried to contact the driver via radio, there was no response. As the hours passed and there was still no word, concern grew. Where was the bus? Where were the driver and conductor? The bus company began making calls. They contacted the driver's family, the conductor's family. Neither had arrived home the previous night. Now it wasn't just a missing bus, it was missing people. The police were notified, this time with a more concrete problem to investigate. A city bus and its crew had vanished somewhere along Route 375. According to the legend, the police began searching the route. One imagines they would have driven along the roads that Bus 375 typically traveled, looking for signs of an accident, a breakdown, anything that might explain. Then, as the legend continues, someone remembered the two people who had come to the station the night before with their strange story about ghosts on a bus. Could there be a connection? Based on how the story unfolds, the police tracked them down and interviewed them again, this time with a more serious tone. This wasn't about humoring people with delusions anymore. This was a missing bus and missing people. The elderly passenger and young man, in the legend's telling, provided their story again with more detail. They described the three figures in Qing Dynasty robes, offered rough locations of where they'd gotten off. This gave the police, within the story's framework, a timeline and a possible last known location. The search could intensify, focusing on the route beyond that point. According to most versions of the legend, it took 2 or 3 days before the bus was finally discovered. The location of the discovery is one of the most consistent elements across different tellings. Miyun Reservoir, about 100 kilometers from Fragrant Hills and far from the route that bus 375 should have been traveling. Miyun Reservoir is a real location, a large body of water northeast of Beijing, created in 1960 as part of a massive hydraulic engineering project. It serves as one of Beijing's primary sources of drinking water, a vast lake surrounded by hills and relatively undeveloped land. In 1995, the area around the reservoir would have been remote, with only a few roads providing access and strict security due to the reservoir's importance to the city's water supply. In the legend, the bus was found submerged in the reservoir's waters. Different versions describe its discovery in various ways. Some say patrol boats found it, others mention someone noticing something unusual from the shore. The condition of the bus itself varies by telling. Some versions describe it as rusted and decayed, as if it had been in the water for years rather than days, adding to the story's supernatural atmosphere. Others describe it as looking relatively normal, just waterlogged, which could suggest a more earthly, if still mysterious, fate. But what was inside the bus was genuinely disturbing. According to the most common versions of the legend, 3 bodies were discovered. They were identified as the bus driver, the conductor, and a third man who could not be immediately identified. This third body had long, unkempt hair, and in the story as told, nobody knew who he was or why he'd been on the bus. This interpretation suggests that only the victims remained, while the 2 figures who had supported the third passenger had vanished, leaving no physical trace behind. However, it's important to note that some versions of the legend claim 5 bodies were found in the bus, which would mean all 3 of the mysterious passengers in Qing Dynasty robes left corpses behind. This variation significantly changes the story's implications, suggesting a more earthly, if still mysterious, tragedy rather than a purely supernatural event. In most tellings of the legend, the condition of the bodies shocked those who discovered them. They were described as badly decomposed, far more than should have been possible in just 2 or 3 days. Even accounting for submersion in water, which can affect decomposition rates, the level of decay reported in the story was anomalous, as if the bodies had been dead for much longer than the time that had passed since the bus. Violence or foul play beyond drowning as the cause of death. In the story as told, the bodies had simply decayed at what seemed an impossible rate, one of the many mysteries that gave the legend its supernatural weight. Part 8. The Impossible Mysteries. As the legend portrays it, investigators faced multiple mysteries when examining what had happened to bus 375. Each new piece of supposed evidence only deepened the puzzle, even setting aside the supernatural elements. If we approach this as one might approach an actual investigation into a missing bus, the problems described in the story are numerous and perplexing. The first mystery concerns location. Miyun Reservoir lies approximately 100 kilometers from Fragrant Hills, the bus's supposed destination. More significantly, the reservoir is in completely the wrong direction. To reach Miyun, from where the witnesses claim they got off, you would need to turn around and drive back toward central Beijing, then veer northeast. Based on what we know of bus routes and their purposes, there's no logical reason why a bus on Route 375 would end up there. This suggests, if the legend were true, several possibilities. Had the bus been hijacked? Had someone overpowered the driver? But this raises its own questions within the story's framework. what would be the motive? And if it was a hijacking, what happened to the hijackers? The legend typically mentions only 3 bodies identified as the driver, conductor, and an unknown man, presumably one of the Qing Dynasty robed passengers, if we accept the witness's account. The second mystery, as described in the legend, concerned fuel. When police supposedly examined the bus's fuel tank, they found it nearly empty according to the story. On one level, this could make sense. The bus had been driving all evening and had then made this lengthy, inexplicable journey to Miyun. But the legend suggests that calculations showed the bus shouldn't have had enough fuel to complete such a trip. After a full day of operation along its regular route, followed by the additional 100+ kilometers to the reservoir, the fuel should have run out before arrival. This is where we must clearly distinguish between the legend's claims and what can be verified. The fuel. Calculations described in the story present a puzzle that feeds into the supernatural narrative, but we have no way to verify the actual fuel capacity of the specific bus allegedly involved, its consumption rate, or how much fuel it had when it departed. And here's where some versions of the legend take their most macabre turn. In certain tellings of the story, particularly later variations, when police opened the fuel tank, they reportedly found it filled not just with the dregs of gasoline, but with blood. Fresh blood, still liquid, still unmistakably blood. The fuel tank, in these embellished versions, had been topped up with human blood instead of gasoline. This detail is particularly striking because it suggests something physically impossible. No vehicle can run on blood. Blood is not a combustible fuel. A bus filled with blood in its fuel tank would simply stop running. And it's worth noting that this blood detail appears to be a later addition to the legend rather than part of the earliest versions, one of many embellishments that accrued to the story as it spread and was retold. The core mystery about the insufficient fuel remains consistent, but the blood element represents how urban legends evolve and become more dramatic with each retelling. The third mystery described in the legend concerns security footage. Miyun Reservoir, being a crucial source of drinking water for Beijing, would have had security measures in place, likely including cameras at access points. According to the story, police reviewed all the security footage from the relevant time period, trying to determine how the bus had entered the reservoir area. In the legend's telling, they found nothing. Not a single frame showed bus 375. The cameras were supposedly working properly and captured other vehicles, but somehow a large city bus had entered the area and ended up in the water without appearing on any footage. This detail, as presented in the story, adds another layer of impossibility. How could this happen? The legend leaves us with unsettling questions. Had the cameras malfunctioned at the precise moment the bus passed? Had someone tampered with the footage? Or had the bus simply passed through without registering, like a ghost unseen by mechanical eyes? Of course, this element of the story is difficult to verify. We have no access to security footage from Miyun Reservoir from 1995, and the very premise assumes the bus was there, which remains unconfirmed. The fourth mystery, and perhaps the most viscerally disturbing element of the legend, concerns the body's condition. As mentioned, the decomposition was described as far more advanced than should have been possible. The specifics, as related in various versions, are worth examining. The driver and conductor's bodies were badly decayed, but at least identifiable as having been human, their identities confirmable through available means. But the third body, the unidentified man with long unkempt hair, was reportedly in even worse condition. The advanced state of decay suggested, within the story's logic, that this person had been dead longer than the driver and conductor. This raises troubling questions if we follow the legend's implications. Had this person been dead before boarding the bus? Was this a corpse that had somehow been transported by the other two figures in Qing? Robes? The legend claims that medical examiners confirmed the decomposition as natural, with no evidence of chemical acceleration or violence beyond drowning. Yet the timeline didn't add up, bodies decaying in days at a rate that should have taken weeks or months. Some interpretations suggest that conditions in the reservoir might have affected decay rates, though cold water in November should theoretically have slowed decomposition rather than accelerated it. The fifth mystery, as presented in some versions of the legend, concerned how the bus entered the reservoir. Had it been driven in deliberately? Had it crashed through some barrier or guardrail? According to the story, examination of the site revealed no obvious signs of violent entry. The bus was found largely intact, submerged. Based on this description, some have theorized suicide within the legend's framework, that the driver had deliberately driven into the reservoir, taking the conductor and passenger with them. But this explanation creates its own questions. Why would the driver do this? The story provides no indication of psychological problems or personal crises. And why drive all the way to Miyun Reservoir specifically? If self-harm was the intent, there would have been many easier methods and closer locations available. All of these mysteries, as presented in the various tellings of the legend, paint a picture that seems to defy rational explanation. A bus that supposedly traveled on blood instead of fuel. Bodies that decayed impossibly fast. Security cameras that failed to capture evidence. A location that made no sense. An entry into the reservoir that left no clear signs. A skeptical approach might argue that each individual mystery, if it occurred as described, could have a potential explanation. Perhaps fuel calculations were incorrect. Perhaps security cameras did malfunction at an inopportune moment. Perhaps decomposition was unusual, but not truly impossible under specific conditions. Perhaps evidence of the bus's entry was simply missed during investigation. But here's where the legend derives its power. The cumulative weight of all these impossibilities becomes increasingly difficult to explain away through conventional means. When you stack enough unlikely circumstances together, the number of required coincidences begins to strain credulity. This is precisely how effective urban legends work. They present a cascade of anomalies that, taken together, seem to point toward something beyond ordinary explanation. The legend invites us to consider that the easiest explanation for all these pieces fitting together is also the most terrifying. That something supernatural was at work that night, that the three figures in Qing Dynasty robes were, indeed, what the elderly passenger believed them to be, and that bus 375's journey to Miyun Reservoir was not made by any human agency at all. Part 9. The Birth and Evolution of a Legend. To understand the bus 375 legend, we must examine not just the story itself, but how it came to be known, how it spread, and how it evolved over the years. Because this is where the line between factual event and urban legend becomes most fascinating and most blurry. The earliest versions of the bus 375 story began circulating in Beijing in the late 1990s. The tale was primarily spread through word of mouth passed from person to person, each telling adding small details or changing minor elements. This is how oral tradition works, how myths and legends have always been created and transmitted before the age of mass media and the internet. But the Bus 375 legend had something that gave it unusual power and reach. It was one of the first major urban legends to truly flourish on the early Chinese internet. China first connected to the internet in 1994, just a year before the events in the legend supposedly took place. In the following years, a small but growing number of sprung up, and they quickly filled with contributions from users across the country. The Bus 375 story found a natural home in these spaces. According to researcher Ye Chenyuan, the earliest known online version of the Bus 375 legend was posted to Tianya Club, one of China's oldest and most popular internet forums. Tianya, launched in 1999, had a board specifically dedicated to ghost stories and supernatural experiences called Penglai Ghost Talk. This board became hugely influential in shaping Chinese internet culture around horror and the paranormal. The timing is important here. The Bus 375 legend entered the internet age just as that medium was becoming widely accessible to ordinary Chinese people. This gave it a reach that traditional oral storytelling could never achieve. A person in Shanghai could read the same version of the story as someone in Chengdu or Harbin. The legend transcended regional boundaries and became a national phenomenon. But there's an interesting complication to the story's origins. Some sources suggest that the tale may have actually originated not from a real event in 1995, but from an earlier source entirely. Chinese singer Na Ying reportedly told a very similar story on a radio program before 1995, though she didn't specify any particular bus route. Her version involved a late-night bus, mysterious passengers in old-fashioned clothing, and a narrow escape from danger. Even more intriguingly, the Beijing Evening News published an article in 1994, a year before the events in the legend supposedly occurred, specifically debunking rumors about ghost stories involving the last bus of the night in Beijing. This suggests that tales of supernatural encounters on late-night buses were already circulating in Beijing before November 1995. The Bus 375 story may have been a specific adaptation or evolution of these earlier, vaguer tales. Another possible influence on the legend's spread is the radio program Zhang Zhen Tells Stories, hosted by broadcaster Zhang Zhen. This program launched in 1999, 4 years after the events supposedly occurred, and became one of the most successful horror radio programs in Chinese history. Zhang Zhen's show featured ghost stories and mysterious tales told in his distinctive, unsettling style. While the program couldn't have been the original source of the Bus 375 legend, given its later launch date, it may have helped popularize and spread the tale, potentially adding to or refining certain elements of the story. The exact origins thus become murky. Was there a real incident in November 1995 that inspired the legend? Or is the entire story a fabrication, perhaps based on earlier rumors and tales, given a specific date and route number to make it seem more real and immediate? Researchers and journalists have attempted to verify the story's factual basis. They've searched for police reports from November 1995, news articles from that period, any official documentation of a missing bus and its subsequent discovery. They've found nothing, no police reports, no news coverage, no official acknowledgement that any such incident occurred. The Beijing Evening News and Beijing News both mentioned in the legend as having reported on the story, and some versions of the legend try to explain this absence of evidence by suggesting a cover-up. The government, they claim, suppressed the story to prevent panic or to avoid admitting that something supernatural had occurred. This is a common element in urban legends, the conspiracy that explains why no official evidence exists. But the lack of evidence might simply mean that the event never happened, at least not in the way the legend describes. This doesn't make the legend any less fascinating or culturally significant. Urban legends are not valuable because they're true in a factual sense. They're valuable because they reveal something about the culture that creates and maintains them, about the fears and beliefs that animate a society. As the legend spread online, it began to evolve. Different versions emerged, each with small variations. In some versions, the number of the bus isn't 375, but 302, or 330, or 331, or 347. The basic structure of the story remains the same, but the specific details change. This is typical of urban legends, which exist in multiple versions simultaneously, each teller adapting the story slightly to their own purposes or based on their own understanding. In some versions, the elderly passenger is a woman, in others, a man. In some, there's a young couple on the bus who get off before the crucial events, in others, they're absent. In some, the bus is found overturned in a ditch, rather than submerged in a reservoir. In some, only the driver and conductor's bodies are found. The third body is absent. Each version is the true version according to the person telling it. One particularly interesting variation concerns what happened to the three figures in Qing Dynasty robes. In the most common version, only 3 bodies are found, implying that the 2 men supporting the third were spirits, or jiangshi, not flesh and blood corpses. But in some versions, 5 bodies are discovered in the bus, suggesting that all 3 of the mysterious passengers were real people, or at least physical corpses. This variation significantly changes the implications of the story. If 5 bodies were found, it suggests a more earthly horror, perhaps a murder or kidnapping that ended badly. If only 3 bodies were found, it suggests something supernatural, that the 2 supporting figures vanished without leaving any physical trace. The legend also began to be embellished with additional details not present in early versions. The detail about the fuel tank being filled with blood appears to be a later addition, not present in the earliest tellings. Similarly, some more elaborate versions include descriptions of the decomposed bodies in grotesque detail, or add elements about the smell of decay that filled the bus, or include dialogue between the mysterious figures that no one could have heard if they'd remained silent. These embellishments are natural to storytelling. Each teller adds elements they think make the story more frightening or more compelling. Over time, these additions can become accepted parts of the legend, even if they weren't present in the original telling. The Bus 375 legend also spread beyond online forums and word of mouth. It began appearing in collections of. The story took on a life of its own, becoming one of the most famous Chinese urban legends, known to virtually anyone who spent time on Chinese internet forums in the 2000s and 2010s. It became a cultural touchstone, story that everyone knew, even if the details they knew varied depending on which version they'd heard. Part 10. Psychological and Cultural Resonance. The bus. 375 legend endures not because it might be true in a factual sense, but because it resonates on a deeper level. It taps into primal fears and cultural anxieties that are very real, even if the events described are not. Let's consider what the story is really about at its core. It's about vulnerability, about being trapped in a confined space with something dangerous and not being able to escape. The bus setting is crucial here. Unlike a car, where you might be able to stop and get out at any time, a public bus operates on a schedule and route. You're dependent on the driver to stop, on the doors to open. There's a loss of personal control that's inherent to the experience of riding public transportation. Add to this the isolation of the last bus of the night. The crowds and safety of numbers are gone. You're traveling through darkness, through areas that might be deserted, where help is far away. It's just you, a handful of strangers, and the night pressing in around you. This is inherently unsettling even before anything supernatural is introduced. The legend also plays on the fear of the unknown passenger. When you ride public transportation, you're sharing space with strangers. Most of the time, they're just ordinary people going about their lives. But what if one of them isn't? What if someone dangerous boards the bus? What if you can't tell until it's too late? The three figures in Qing Dynasty robes represent this fear made manifest. They're clearly wrong, clearly other, but no. One can quite admit what they're seeing until the elderly passenger forces the issue. There's also the theme of ignored warnings, of dismissing concerns because they don't fit with our modern, rational worldview. The conductor offers a rational explanation for the men in period costume, and everyone wants to believe it because the alternative is too frightening. The police initially dismiss the elderly passenger and young man's story because it involves the supernatural. This reflects a real tension in modern Chinese society between traditional beliefs and scientific modernity. The elderly passenger represents traditional wisdom and knowledge of the old ways. The young man represents modern education and rational thinking. The fact that it's the elderly passenger who perceives the danger and saves the young man's life is significant. It's a validation of traditional knowledge, a suggestion that perhaps the old ways and old beliefs shouldn't be so quickly dismissed. This generational theme is particularly relevant in the context of 1990s China. The country was undergoing rapid modernization and economic transformation. Traditional ways of life were being swept away in favor of modern apartment blocks, consumer goods, and Western influences. Older generations watched as the world they knew disappeared, worried that important cultural knowledge and traditions would be lost. Dynasty robes are literally ghosts of the past, of a China that was destroyed and humiliated by foreign powers. Their appearance on a modern city bus is a collision of past and present, a suggestion that history and tradition can't be so easily left behind. The story also reflects anxieties about rapid urbanization. In 1995, Beijing was expanding dramatically. Villages were being absorbed, farmland was being paved over, new developments were springing up. The route that bus 375 traveled represented this transition zone between the old city and the new suburbs, between history and modernity. It's no accident that the legend is set in this liminal space. The Miyun Reservoir detail is interesting from this perspective too. The reservoir is a modern creation built in 1960 as part of the communist government's massive infrastructure projects. It represents modernization and scientific progress, providing water for millions of people. But it's also a place where the past was drowned. Villages were flooded, farmland submerged, burial grounds lost beneath the waters. Finding the ghost bus in Miyun Reservoir can be seen as symbolic. Modernity trying to contain the past, but the past emerging anyway. Dead, but not quite gone. There's also a universal human fear at work, the fear of the dead not staying dead. This is a fear that transcends culture, appearing in myths and legends worldwide. But Chinese culture has its own particular relationship with death and the dead. Ancestor worship is central to traditional Chinese belief. Proper burial rites are crucial. The dead must be shown respect and given their due, or they become restless and dangerous. The jiangshi, the hopping corpse, represents what happens when these rites are not observed, when the dead are not properly honored. A jiangshi is a corpse that can't rest because something went wrong, because they died far from home, or died violently, or weren't buried properly. The three figures on bus 375, if we accept them as jiangshi, represent this cultural anxiety about the dead being unable to find peace. In a broader sense, the bus 375 legend is about the persistence of the irrational in a rational world. Despite scientific education, despite modernization, despite official atheism and materialism, the legend suggests that there are still things that can't be explained, that the supernatural is real and dangerous. For some, this is frightening. For others, it's weirdly comforting, a suggestion that the universe is more mysterious and magical than our everyday experiences might suggest. Part 11. Investigations and Debunking. As the bus 375 legend grew in popularity, it also attracted the attention of skeptics and investigators determined to uncover the truth. Their findings are revealing, not because they definitively prove the legend false, but because they illustrate how urban legends function and why they persist even in the face of contrary evidence. The most basic fact that investigators have established is the absence of official records. Multiple researchers have searched through Beijing police archives, bus company records, and newspaper archives from November 1995 and the surrounding months. They've found no reports of a missing bus, no stories about mysterious researchers over the years, and none remember any story about a ghost bus or supernatural encounters. Given that such a story would have been sensational and memorable, this absence of institutional memory is telling. The bus companies that operate Route 375 and similar routes have no records of any incidents matching the legend. No buses went missing in November 1995. No drivers or conductors disappeared. No vehicles were found in Miyun Reservoir. The route number 375 does exist and did exist in 1995, but it has operated continuously without any mysterious incidents on record. The Beijing police have similarly stated, when asked, that they have no records of any incident matching the bus 375 legend. No reports of supernatural encounters on buses, no investigations of buses found in reservoirs, no searches for missing transit vehicles in late 1995. Investigators have also looked into the specific details that would be verifiable if the story were true. Miyun Reservoir has security measures and administrative oversight. If a city bus had been found submerged in the reservoir, it would have been a significant event requiring official reports, environmental assessments, recovery, operations, and more. There are no records of any such event. The detail about bodies being discovered inside the bus would have triggered extensive police investigations, autopsies, identification processes, and likely media coverage. The families of the driver and conductor would have been notified, death certificates issued, funerals held. There would be a paper trail. None of this exists. Some believers in the legend argue that this absence of evidence is itself suspicious, suggesting a cover-up by authorities who wanted to suppress knowledge of supernatural events. This is a common move in conspiracy thinking. The lack of evidence becomes evidence of a conspiracy to hide the truth. But the problem with this argument is that it requires us to believe in a conspiracy of incredible breadth and discipline. Not just police and government officials, but also journalists, bus company employees, reservoir, administrators, hospital staff who would have dealt with the bodies, funeral home workers, family members of the deceased, and anyone else who would have been involved would all need to be either actively conspiring to hide the truth or somehow prevented from speaking about it. This is possible in theory, but it strains credulity. A more likely explanation is simpler. The event didn't happen, at least not as described in the legend. This doesn't mean someone didn't have an unsettling experience on a late-night bus, or that there wasn't some incident that formed the seed of the story. But the specific details of Bus 375, November 14, 1995, 3 figures. In Qing robes, a bus found in Miyun Reservoir, these appear to be elaborations, fictional details added to make the story more concrete and compelling. Researchers have also noted the variations in the story as evidence of its legendary nature. If this were a real event, you'd expect the basic facts to remain consistent: the bus number, the date, the location where witnesses got off, the location where the bus was found. But these details vary significantly between versions, suggesting that the story evolved through retelling rather than being an account of a specific real incident. Supernatural stories is that they exist outside normal verification systems. The supernatural, by definition, doesn't leave the kind of evidence that would satisfy scientific or legal standards of proof. A ghost doesn't show up on video. A jiangshi doesn't leave DNA evidence. If you start from the premise that supernatural events are real but unprovable by normal means, then the absence of official records doesn't disprove anything. Moreover, many believers point to the testimony of the witnesses, the elderly passenger and young man, as evidence. But here we run into a problem. These witnesses are anonymous and unverifiable. No one has ever come forward with a name, with identification, saying, "I was the young man on bus 375. The witnesses exist only within the legend, and their testimony can't be examined or questioned. The cultural context matters here too. In Chinese internet culture, particularly in the early 2000s, when the legend was spreading, there was a deliberate blurring of the line between truth and fiction in the horror story community. Stories were often presented as true even when everyone understood they were probably fictional. The fun was in the ambiguity, in the possibility, not in determining objective truth. From a folklore perspective, whether the bus 375 incident really happened is almost beside the point. The legend exists, it's widely known, it influences behavior. People really did start being more cautious about late-night buses. And it tells us something about the culture that created and maintains it. That's what makes it significant, not its factual accuracy. Part 12. Legacy and Cultural Impact. More than 2.5 decades after the events described in the legend supposedly occurred, the bus 375 story continues to resonate in Chinese culture. Its influence can be seen in various ways, from practical effects on behavior to its place in popular culture and folklore. One of the most tangible impacts is on actual bus riding behavior in Beijing. Multiple accounts exist of people, particularly older individuals, or those familiar with the legend, refusing to board the last bus of the night, especially on routes in the northwestern part of the city. Some deliberately make sure to catch an earlier bus, arranging their schedules to avoid that final, lonely ride through the darkness. Late-night bus passengers in Beijing sometimes avoid sitting in the back of the bus, the area where the three mysterious figures allegedly sat in the legend. There's a superstition that the back of the bus, particularly on late runs, is somehow more vulnerable to supernatural presence. Similarly, some people make a point of sitting near the driver and conductor, as if proximity to the bus's crew offers some protection. Bus drivers and conductors are aware of the legend, and some have their own superstitions or practices related to late-night runs. Some will reportedly refuse to stop for passengers who aren't at official bus stops after a certain hour. Others burn incense or carry protective talismans, particularly if they regularly work the latest shifts. In broader Chinese popular culture, the Bus 375 legend has become a reference point, shorthand for a particular. The legend has inspired creative works. Horror films have drawn on its elements, even if they don't directly adapt the story. TV dramas exploring urban legends frequently include versions of the Bus 375 tale. Online, fiction writers have written their own takes on the story, adding new details or reframing it from different perspectives. The story has also become educational material in a sense. It's used as an example when teaching about folklore, urban legends, and internet culture. Academics studying modern Chinese society have written papers analyzing what the legend reveals about anxieties and beliefs in contemporary China. The story has become a case study in how traditional supernatural beliefs persist and adapt in modern, urban, technologically advanced settings. Interestingly, the legend has also led to tourism of a sort. Some Chinese and international tourists interested in dark history or paranormal phenomena seek out the locations mentioned in the story. Yuanmingyuan, fragrant hills, and even Miyun Reservoir have attracted visitors specifically because of their connection to the legend, though officials generally don't encourage or acknowledge this association. The bus route numbers associated with the legend, particularly 375, have taken on a certain notoriety. Some people avoid them entirely, while others ride them specifically because of the legend, either out of curiosity as a challenge to prove they're not afraid. Night bus drivers on these routes report occasionally dealing with passengers who ask about the ghost story or young people who board specifically to look for supernatural signs. The legend has also influenced how other urban legends are told and structured in Chinese internet culture. The Bus 375 story established certain conventions, the specific date and location to make it seem real, the mix of rational and supernatural explanations, the wise elder and skeptical youth, the list of impossible mysteries. Subsequent urban legends often follow this template. From an anthropological perspective, the Bus 375 legend represents the adaptation of traditional Chinese ghost stories to modern urban settings. The jiangshi, a figure from ancient folklore, is transplanted onto a city bus, a thoroughly modern conveyance. The story demonstrates that supernatural belief doesn't disappear with modernization. It evolves, finding new contexts and new forms. The legend also speaks to the enduring power of storytelling in creating shared cultural experiences. Despite China's vast size and regional diversity, the Bus 375 story became known across the country, creating a common reference point that people from different provinces and backgrounds could discuss. In a rapidly changing China, such shared narratives help create a sense of connection and common culture. Perhaps most significantly, the Bus 375 legend has become a gateway story, an introduction to Chinese supernatural folklore for a new generation. Young people who might not be interested in traditional ghost stories told by their grandparents might encounter the Bus 375 legend online and become intrigued by the broader world of Chinese supernatural belief. The legend acts as a bridge between traditional folklore and modern urban legend. Say it's superstition that they're too educated and modern for such beliefs. But these same people will often avoid certain behaviors or feel uneasy in situations associated with supernatural danger. They don't quite believe, but they also don't quite disbelieve. The Bus 375 legend exists in this ambiguous space. Most people would say, if asked directly, that they don't think the story is literally true, but they might still feel a chill when boarding a late-night bus, might still avoid sitting in the back, might still glance around nervously if the bus is mostly empty. The legend works on us even if we don't consciously believe it. This is perhaps the real power of urban legends, not that they convince us of specific facts, but that they tap into deep-seated fears and beliefs that persist regardless of our rational education. They remind us that despite all our technology and knowledge, we still feel vulnerable in certain situations. They acknowledge that the world can be strange and frightening, that not everything has a neat explanation. As China continues to modernize and urbanize, as new generations grow up with smartphones and high-speed internet, will legends like Bus 375 fade away? Or will they adapt and persist, finding new platforms and new audiences? If the past decades are any indication, these stories aren't going anywhere. They'll evolve, certainly, taking on new details and new meanings. But the core will remain: the fear of the unknown, the chill of the supernatural, the thrill of a good scary story told in the darkness. Conclusion: the line between legend and reality. We've now traveled the full length of the Bus 375 legend, from its origins on a cold November night in 1995 through its spread across the internet to its lasting impact on Chinese culture. We've examined the specific details of the story, placed it in historical and cultural context, looked at the attempts to verify or debunk it, and considered what it means and why it matters. So, what are we left with? What's the truth about Bus 375? The factual answer is almost certainly that the specific incident described in the legend didn't happen, at least, not as told. There was no bus that disappeared on November 14, 1995, no discovery of bodies in Miyun Reservoir, no investigation that found impossibly decomposed corpses and blood in a fuel tank. The paper trail that such an event would have created doesn't exist. The legend is just that: a legend, a story, a piece of modern folklore rather than a historical event. But this answer, while factually accurate, misses something important. Because in another sense, the Bus 375 story is very real. It's real in the fear it inspires, real in its influence on behavior, real in its place in Chinese cultural consciousness. It's real in what it reveals about anxieties and beliefs in modern China, about the persistence of supernatural belief, about the tensions between tradition and modernity. The legend reminds us that truth comes in different forms. There's factual truth, the truth of what, actually, happened that can be verified through evidence and documentation. But there's also mythic truth, the truth of. Thin line between the familiar and the strange. It gives form to fears that many people feel, but might not articulate, that despite all our modern comforts and knowledge, there are still things we don't understand, still dangers we can't predict. The story also does something that good legends always do. It provides a warning and a lesson wrapped in. Entertainment. The lesson of Bus 375 is to pay attention to your surroundings, to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, to respect the wisdom of elders even when it seems to conflict with modern rationality. These are practical lessons, useful advice, given weight and memorability through supernatural clothing. If you're traveling alone late at night, you should be aware of your fellow passengers. You should notice if something seems off. You should be prepared to leave a situation that feels dangerous, even if you can't. Articulate exactly why you feel threatened. The Bus 375 legend teaches these lessons more effectively than any safety pamphlet or rational warning could. The legend also serves a social function, creating a shared narrative that binds people together. When Chinese people talk about Bus 375, they're participating in a communal experience, sharing in a story that everyone knows. They're connected through this narrative thread, part of a culture that includes not just their immediate friends and family, but potentially millions of people across the country. From a certain perspective, urban legends like Bus 375 are how modern, urban societies create mythology. Ancient cultures had their gods and heroes, their epic tales of struggle against supernatural forces. Modern, urban societies have urban legends, contemporary stories that serve similar functions, teaching lessons and creating shared cultural experiences. The jiangshi, those hopping corpses from traditional Chinese folklore, find new life in the Bus 375 legend. They're updated for the modern era, appearing not on deserted rural roads, but on city buses, not to ancient travelers, but to contemporary students and workers. The legend keeps the old stories alive by adapting them to new contexts. As for whether ghosts are real, whether supernatural events truly occur, whether the three figures on Bus 375 were actually undead spirits, each person must answer that question for themselves. Skeptics will point to the lack of evidence and the psychological explanations for supernatural belief. Believers will point to experiences that defy easy explanation, to the persistence of such stories across cultures and time, to the fact that absence of proof isn't proof of absence. What we can say with certainty is that the fear is real. The unease you might feel boarding a nearly empty bus late at night is real. The chill that runs down your spine when you see something you can't quite explain is real. Whether that fear is responding to actual supernatural danger or to evolutionarily ingrained caution about vulnerable situations, the experience is genuine. The Bus 375 legend will continue to circulate, likely for many years to come. It will continue to evolve, with new versions adding details or changing elements to reflect contemporary concerns. perhaps future versions, usually acknowledge. For those who travel late at night through Beijing's streets, the legend serves as a companion of sorts, a story that acknowledges the particular atmosphere of those journeys. It validates the feeling that late-night travel is different, that the usual rules don't quite apply when darkness falls and the city empties out. It gives voice to the unease that many feel but few discuss. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps it doesn't matter whether Bus 375 really carried ghostly passengers on a November night in 1995. What matters is that the story exists, that it's told and retold, that it shapes how people think about late-night buses and dark streets and the supernatural. What matters is that it keeps alive a sense of mystery and wonder, an acknowledgement that for all our science and technology, there are still things we don't fully understand. So the next time you find yourself on a bus late at night, as darkness presses against the windows and the stops grow farther apart, remember the legend of Bus 375. Pay attention to your fellow passengers. Notice if something seems wrong. Trust your instincts. And if you see three figures in old-fashioned robes with pale faces and hanging heads, perhaps consider getting off at the next stop just to be safe. Because legends persist for a reason. They carry warnings that our ancestors learned through hard experience, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's better to be overly cautious than to become another story that people tell to frighten each other on dark nights. The bus continues through the darkness, its route unchanging, its schedule unaltered, and somewhere in that darkness, between the known and the unknown, between the rational and the supernatural, the legend of Bus 375 lives on, waiting for the next person to board that last bus of the night. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of China's most enduring urban legends, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more stories like this one, tales from cultures around the world that blur the line between history and horror, between fact and folklore. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and perhaps think twice before boarding that last bus home.